Hello, I'm Dr. Mercy Masta from the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. 2025 marks 25 years since the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. This was a landmark resolution that recognized the vital role that women played in preventing conflict, building peace, and leading recovery efforts. Over the past quarter century, it has shaped how governments, organizations, and communities think about security, not just as the absence of violence, but as the presence of inclusion and equality. Fijian feminist Sharon Bhagwan-Rolls is one of the Pacific's leading peace advocates and a longtime champion of women's voices in peace building and media. She has played a key role in advancing the past women's peace and security agenda in the Pacific. So I'm very delighted to welcome Sharon to talk about her work and also to reflect on the progress made over the past 25 years and explore what lies ahead of women, peace and security in the Pacific. Thank you, Sharon, for joining us today. Sharon, you have been very busy in the past few years in your role with the Pacific Women Mediators Network. So can you tell us about major projects that you have been working on recently, and what are some of the major findings that have come out from your work?
Oh, I mean, the network is only 2 years old as the Pacific Women Mediators Network, but it was conceived, through conversations with the former Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Dame Meg Taylor. And in the conversations around that unfinished business or the lack of implementation of the Pacific Regional Action Plan on women, peace and security that our leaders endorsed for the period 2012 to 2015. It's still a fantastic plan, and we firmly believe it should be revitalized as part of the work going forward. So a couple of things have happened in terms of the network, because we draw on the legacy. And the legacy of Pacific Island women peace builders goes beyond 2000. 25 years was certainly catalytic in terms of putting WPS into the Security Council agenda, but that came from that rich legacy. I mean, Helen Hakena of Bougainville was part of the group of women who made the submission, in terms of the petition for the resolution. So we were there. The Pacific was represented. And that legacy is so critical, because quite often in this journey, I go back to 1994 and the Pacific Platform for Action. When you look at the language under peace and justice that our governments and civil society pulled together ahead of the big UN Fourth World Conference on Women, they were making the connections with, the nuclear justice issue, the climate and ecological justice issue, but they were actually also very much ahead of the time in terms of talking about sustainable development. So when we think about Agenda 2030 now and the peace and development nexus and the humanitarian connections, that was there. We draw on those conversations. The last 2 years has really been a lot about learning within the network to understand who are we as a women's network of mediators and peace builders, and what is our purpose in drawing from this fabulous legacy and the community peace building, but to go into the political space. Yes, it is about getting women deployed, not just in the Pacific, but having a database of Pacific Island women, peace builders, mediators who can be deployed globally. But how do we also shift that focus that women peace building is this nice community activity, and we'll just stay over there? No, this is a feminist practice, so we're moving it into the political agenda. And the timing was right. The Blue Pacific Strategy has a peace and security pillar. Good language there also in terms of the linkages with the Leaders' Gender Equality Declaration and its dedicated paragraph on WPS. Making sure that our politics within the network was key. We don't just do this because of WPS, because of 1325. 1325 is certainly catalytic, but we're doing this because as all Pacific Islanders, we want to live in peace. And what does that peace mean in the context as the biggest threat being climate change, right? What does that mean in the context of oceans as well? So getting the politics right, being clear on our purpose within the political spaces, and being able to start a learning that helps craft what does the future look like as we bring in younger women. So a feminist practice is one that's always about the foresight for succession planning. How do we develop that? And how do we also start to develop the messaging for the various government officials who need to be involved in this conversation on gender equality in WPS? So one of the things very early on that we talk about as the network is we talk about a Pacific gender equality and women, peace and security. It's so important that the language is more diverse and inclusive, but it also aligns to the fact that our leaders have committed to the Gender Equality Declaration. So the 2 years has been about convenings and learnings. We had our colloquium in Honiara, which gave us such strong, fabulous language that I'm so glad is sitting in the Ocean of Peace Declaration, not only on gender equality and diversity, but also about the rich tradition and customs of peace building in our Pacific that we can draw on and utilize while still framing it within a human rights context, so still being accountable to the human rights agenda. And that's really the thing that we also take into the multilateral space, that you don't have to tell us about peace building in the Pacific, it's there. But actually, part of this journey is actually decolonizing some of our own thinking to actually re-embrace. We embrace it, but we have to re-embrace it and make it more, give it that kind of impetus to be used in a way that it is in line with these commitments to equality and human rights and peace. But it is very much about the Pacific. And I think the other learning of the last 2 years is that we can't just paint this brush and say the Pacific and we mean all, all the 22 Pacific Island countries and territories. There has to be a better sub-regional approach, and it has to be about drawing on examples and evidence from communities across the different island nations. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. There's a lot of work that you and other women in the Pacific,
Yes, I mean, it is a network approach, and I think that's the value. Yeah.
It's amazing. Just thinking about sort of, bringing it back home to the Pacific, how do you think the different findings from your conversation with women throughout the Pacific, how that can strengthen individual countries' policies, as well as their national processes and structures?
Yes, so I mean, this week I've also been reflecting that 10 years ago, you'll recall in March 2015, there was TC-PAM, yeah? And I was sitting in a UN conference room in 2015 during the UN Commission on the Status of Women, on a panel with the then head of UN Women. Nolene Nambulivo was sitting right at the end of the table, and we were talking about Pacific priorities or global priorities, but from our regional perspectives. And what does that mean in the context then of the global study that was taking place, which was being written by Radhika Kumraswamy? And I talked about, as small island states, what did a Category 5 storm such as Vanuatu mean? Because the ripples of that devastation wasn't just in Vanuatu. We were getting stories of how it was impacting many of our own smaller islands. And that conversation in that room that day resulted in the collaboration with UN Women to get climate change into the resolution 2242, but also catalyze this emerging work that I'm just so proud of now when we talk about weaving this cross-movement mat with people like Nolene from Diva for Equality, Frances Namaumau from the Pacific Conference of Churches, these women who are really the climate experts when it comes to our network. So I've learned, in the course of the 10 years, like the evidence, the work that is happening across the different movements that women are leading. How do we gather that information and then craft it into a peace building approach, And similarly, how do we talk about peace building in that context of climate? There's a need to really bring those strands together because quite often we can end up in the silos. And I used to fear even mentioning UNFCCC. I'd be very comfortable. I can talk about Security Council resolutions, but don't get me started on UNFCCC. But now we have this comfort of being able to see how do we take this agenda on climate and put it into the peace and security agenda, etc. So I think that's what's important in the context of our own small island states, that we are small governments. We can't keep putting the pressure on our governments to say you have to have a national action plan on WPS, and then what? You know, yes, if you're going to have a policy, let it be linked to all of these commitments, but let's also look at the way in which we can help with greater efficiency in the learnings that we are doing as a network that governments must be learning as well. How can we create spaces where they're not running around trying to do everything, but they actually have the time and space so that traditional security, Department of Women, national planning, you know, peace building ministry can all be sitting together coming up with their government strategy. So that's, I think, one way that I hope, now that we have the Ocean of Peace Declaration with the Bowie Declaration Action Plan review process, we can start to talk about the development of infrastructures of peace and a regional peace building architecture that supports that. Don't assume, like we should never assume even that our government officials understand these concepts of gender equality and, you know why they fear the word feminism. But, you know, how do we get them to understand that? How do we get them to understand peace building and what it means, and why it does take time, and that it's there in our customs, it's there in our traditions. It's not something that's supplanted. But to my earlier point, how do we also do that better at the sub-regional level? Because there are specific and distinct needs across the Pacific that also needs to be addressed. So for me, that's, yeah, I think strengthening national processes needs to allow the space for the government officials and for civil society to do their learnings and then to be able to come together to really develop their national strategies and subnational. Because if we're talking about the drivers of insecurities and conflicts, it really must be focused on not just the macro, but very much the micro level. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you've talked about is really important for us in terms of, you know, connecting, listening to each other's voices, right? So for the government as well as for experts who are on the ground in the women, peace and security are women themselves. And so having learned from each other and having those dialogue and feeding into the kind of national structures or processes that we have.
Maybe I'll just add
Yeah.
one thing. One of the things we actually have to learn also is the communication. It's how do I communicate what I'm finding, for example, from community human security assessments to somebody who is sitting in the traditional security structure and is looking at things in a very different way. So part of that learning is to help the government officials, like I said, learn peace building and understand what might be coming from the communities, while at the same time helping the communities to gather all of that beautiful qualitative evidence, listen to the communities, but then to be able to present it, whether it's through parliamentary submissions or engaging with the national mechanisms, and then being able to talk to each other. Because it's not just about what language we speak, it's actually the terminologies, you know, and even on gender equality, how do we just talk about the communities? How do we talk about the people? So I think communication is going to be critical.
We kind of already started almost talking about recommendations and implications. So what are your thoughts around implications and recommendations for our regional policies or our regional security architecture, and how does this work factor into the implementation of the Bowie Declaration as well as the Oceans of Peace?
So now that we've got Oceans of Peace, I think we all have to rebrand and talk about a regional peace building and human security architecture, because the Bowie Declaration to me is human security first. Yes, there have been the focus on traditional security historically, particularly at the forum level. But now that we have the Ocean of Peace Declaration, it's a chance to merge. So we can redefine this peace building or regional architecture in a way that is linked to the peace and security pillar. It was there already in the Blue Pacific strategy. I think the declaration has given us that impetus, like I said, to actually make sure peace building is there and open that space for the commitments of including civil society and peace builders, including our work with faith and traditional leaders into that process, and young people as well. That is, if we can get those mechanisms right at the regional level, and so a lot is riding on how the Pacific Islands Forum will organize itself or reorganize itself. There's the technical advisory group, which we understand will have civil society representation. And in the coming month, I believe through the Pringo Alliance, there'll be a conversation with PIFs about representation. So we now have civil society at the table with the governments involved in the forum process that leads all the way up to the leaders meeting. That's, that's been part of the journey of the 25 years, right? When discovering, like, we have Security Council, what do we have in the Pacific, right? But how do we make sure that in those arrangements there is the channel of information? So we have been gearing up to say, okay, how do we work as the Women Mediators Network within this bigger peace building network of GPAC to keep this flow of information going, to create spaces where our program associates can be doing the human security assessments across the Pacific. That's building younger people's capacities to talk about human security and peace building, not just to women, but to young people, to our faith, traditional leaders, through the network and the alliance members. How do they present the findings in a way to government officials and back to the communities? And how do we then have the time and space? Because we have many fantastic leaders in our regional civil society, but they are so busy running organizations. One of them happens to be my brother as the General Secretary of the PCC, so I do have to book time with him regularly. But if I can book his time on a quarterly basis to then come and listen to the program associates, and then craft the kinds of recommendations that they can take back when they talk to the faith leaders, when we talk to the government officials and our leaders, then that's the kind of process I envisage. And I know it can work. We've had stops and starts along the way. We had a fantastic pilot earlier this month when we hosted the Australian Ambassador for Gender Equality in Suva. So we know it's possible, and we know that the Pacific Island missions will come, because they also want to hear from the voices. But like I said, it has to come in a way that is systematic, that is communicating. So you hear the voices of the communities, but it has to then be framed in a way that government officials can then use it, right? That's the political work. So hopefully that can happen. And with the small baselines that we've done, it's really, I just feel so privileged to be part of this process where I can see younger women going out and taking the brief and making it their own. In Tonga, they had a deep dive into the trauma, the relief and recovery, the healing that's needed as a result of the displacement from the Hunga volcanic eruption for the communities that have been relocated in Tongatapu. With a diaspora of Micronesian students, the PCC's convening was in Suva. They do a lot of work in the Northern Pacific, but it was bringing together students who are studying and thinking about their own situations in Nauru, Kiribati, Palau, Marshall Islands as well. And a lot of that coming through in art, in really creative forms as well. The work of bringing faith and ethnic groups together through the work of Pacific Center for Peace Building was very inspiring. And then we're also looking at the ways in which we can use the same framework to support women leaders like Rosa Moiwend from Papua, Helen Hakena in Bougainville, to draw out their priority issues. Because I think in the context of Papua and West Papua and Bougainville, as well as in the other decolonization issues, there needs a slightly different approach. So yeah, just being able to kind of co-create this idea, but just letting it flourish. And once again, that's feminist practice, right? It's not an academic exercise, but it's just enabling that ownership in collecting the information, processing the information, and communicating it. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much, Sharon, for like the describing these recommendations and implications, but in a way that's grounded in our values, and what for us as the Pacific is our way of life. So as we mentioned earlier, it's been 25 years since the adoption of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, of which you have been at the forefront for several decades now. What are some of the reflections that you may have in terms of looking at this anniversary, and what lessons or words of encouragement or wisdom you have for those who are just joining or coming along in this journey?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I can't stress enough the need to read. You actually have to make time to sometimes read these declarations, these Security Council resolutions, even if the language looks odd, but to look at it and see, okay, what does this mean, right? So that's one. Read, 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 read. And the more I read, 2000, 2001, and I had these wonderful mentors who were part of the drafting of the resolution, so I feel their spirit in everything that's written on that paper, that they were thinking across the globe, so it was very much a feminist approach. But one of the first things that I realized was what I was reading did not reflect our Pacific Island journey. I think at one stage there was a bit of focus on Bougainville because of the crisis there, but it was still being seen in that kind of armed conflict, post-conflict scenario. So it wasn't really our peace building, right? And when we coalesced together in the early 2000s, it was really around the prevention of the resurgence of violence, on the experience of that. So how do we make sure that our Pacific Island legacy is there? And so the Pacific Women Mediators Network, part of our knowledge product, is going to be a series of books. So we're going to launch a book. The first legacy book should be coming out in a few months' time. That's been fantastic. But I always encourage younger women and younger men, but particularly younger women in the movement, is know your story through your mothers and your aunties and your grandmothers. If we don't know the stories of our own peace-building practice, then everything we talk about can be quite shallow. We're just like reciting a resolution. So we have to make that connection back into our own her stories, our own customs, tradition, and the women's customs and traditions, knowing the roles that Pacific Island women have played. I mean, I once bought a bow and arrow at an arts festival because I knew that was what the women broke in Bougainville to end the war, right? Like the breaking of the bows and arrows for me is one of the most powerful representation of disarmament, right? We have to know, we have to know what's happened in the multilateral, but we have to connect it back to our Pacific. And I think that was part of the challenge in the early days, that when you only talk about WPS and Security Council resolution, people think it's not got nothing to do with us. So in the 25 years, we as a Pacific Island region have localized the agenda. We have made it our own. And I think strategically now, it's not just talking about gender equality and WPS in the Security Council, but the whole peace-building architecture reform of the UN system. The whole look at the way in which climate, humanitarian, and disasters are looked at through that lens, that Pacific Island lens as well, and particularly the lens of small island states. And to be able to, I hope that the linkage with the peace and development agenda, so Agenda 2030, which is, the timeline it's ticking, that we can progress in some way that connects, like we have the pillars of the Blue Pacific Strategy, we have these pillars of the SDGs. How do we bring together the climate, oceans, gender equality with SDG 16? and kind of use it as a way to tell our story as Pacific Island people, and talk about Pacific Island peace building.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon. And that reminds me that I'm also sort of contributing to this space through my work as looking at Indigenous peace practices, and particularly the role of men and women in different I guess, spaces or contexts in the Pacific. So, Vinaka Vakalevu, Sharon, for sharing your time with us and your generosity and the way in which you talk about your work and the experiences of women in the Pacific. So thank you again very much for that. So for those who are watching today around the region, thank you for joining us. Thank you to the Pacific Security College at the Australian National University for bringing us all together.